Have you ever felt so desperate, so alone, that it felt like God had turned away from you? What if I told you that there is a psalm, written millennia ago, that still carries the power today to heal broken hearts, even when everything seems lost? Psalm 22 begins with a cry of anguish. My God, why have you forsaken me?" A cry from David that resonates with all of us, who have lived through moments of suffering where answers don't seem to come. But what David teaches us in this psalm goes beyond pain. It is a journey of transition, where the search for God, even in silence, leads us to a healing that only He can bring. If you've ever felt abandoned, stay until the end, because the 22nd Psalm reveals a hope that goes beyond human understanding and a healing that spans time, touching your soul today. Don't let that word slip. God has the restoration you need, even when everything seems impossible. In moments of deep anguish, when everything seems to fall apart and hope seems distant, human beings are faced with an existential void that can only be filled by something much greater. On the most difficult days, when loneliness presses and suffering reaches the core, many ask themselves, "Where is God? Why do I feel so helpless?" These questions, fraught with pain and despair, are not new. They echo through time, across generations. And it is precisely these questions that lead us to Psalm 22, one of the most profound and moving prayers in the entire Bible. Written by King David, this psalm begins with a desperate cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A cry of anguish that resonates in the hearts of many to this day, especially in moments of extreme suffering. This psalm, although it was written in the 19th century before Christ, carries in its words a transforming power that spans the millennia, touching souls who, like David, feel lost and abandoned. In his pain, David expresses not only his anguish, but also a deep longing for a divine answer that transcends human understanding. This cry of despair, although it was released in the past, remains a universal language. It reflects the suffering that all of us, at some point in our lives, experience. Psalm 22, however, is not limited to despair. It is a transitional psalm, a bridge between pain and healing. When David cries out to God, he not only laments his lot, but seeks a greater purpose, a reason to continue believing, even when circumstances seem impossible. This journey of faith in the midst of anguish is the key to understanding what the psalm offers, a hope that goes beyond immediate pain, an invitation to experience God's presence even in the deepest suffering. As the psalm progresses, it reveals a powerful shift in perspective. Although the initial cry of abandonment is the starting point, it does not remain there. David's prayer movement, marked by intense moments of pain, also paves the way for renewed confidence. This process of spiritual transformation reflects the cycle of human suffering, from lament to hope. And in the end, trust in God does not depend on explaining suffering, but on faith that even in affliction, He is present, leading us to healing. The emotional depth of Psalm 22. It is immense, and its intensity cannot be ignored. But to truly understand the impact of this psalm, we need to return to the context in which it was written. David, a man who experienced both victories and defeats, wrote these words in a time of persecution, isolation, and spiritual pain. He was being rejected by those who had once supported him, facing suffering that seemed endless. And at that moment, he turned to God, not with empty words, but with a sincere supplication, baring his soul. When observing David's attitude, we see someone willing to be completely honest with God. He doesn't try to hide his pain, but instead cries out openly and vulnerably. This honesty before God is an essential lesson that Psalm 22 teaches us. We don't need to hide our pain when we are suffering. We can be completely transparent, as it is in this process of surrender that we find a path to restoration. David's vulnerability before God invites us to do the same, allowing pain to be the beginning of a healing process. This psalm, although personal, is also collective. David's suffering is not isolated. It reflects common human experience. We all face moments of loss, abandonment, and questioning. Psalm 22 is a reflection of our own spiritual journey, where suffering leads us to question our faith, but also offers us the opportunity to renew it. David, by expressing his pain, gives us permission to do the same, for his experience shows us that when we cry out sincerely, we find space for healing. Although suffering is the central theme of the psalm, it is not presented as something immutable. David's cry is not only an expression of despair, but also of a search for something greater, the restoration of his faith and reconnection with God. Pain and abandonment, however intense they may be, are not the end of the story. On the contrary, they mark the beginning of a journey of healing and spiritual transformation, where faith in God can flourish even in the darkest moments. Psalm 22 teaches us a fundamental lesson, that even when everything seems lost and God's presence seems distant, He is always close. The suffering may be profound, but the promise of His restoration goes beyond our understanding. This psalm invites us to trust, even without fully understanding the reasons for suffering. And in doing so, we find the healing that can only come from God, a healing that goes beyond human logic, but is real and transformative. The Psalm 22. It does not arise from the void. It is a profound expression of a moment of crisis in David's life. To understand the emotional and spiritual charge of this prayer, it is necessary to understand the historical and cultural context that gave rise to these words. King David, one of the most complex and beloved figures in the history of Israel, lived a life marked by victories and defeats, by moments of intense communion with God, and also by periods of great loneliness and affliction. The psalm he wrote, therefore, is not only a reflection of a time of suffering, but also a window into the spiritual and emotional challenges he faced. David was chosen by God to be king of Israel, but his ascension to the throne was not simple. Before being crowned, he spent years fleeing the wrath of King Saul, who, overcome by jealousy and anger, tried to kill him. During this period, David found himself in several situations of extreme danger, loneliness, and rejection. These times of persecution and suffering certainly marked his soul, and it is not difficult to imagine that Psalm 22 was written during one of those moments. In his words, David expresses the pain of rejection, the feeling of being abandoned by God and humanity, something he probably felt during Saul's relentless persecution. It is important to remember that in Israelite culture in the 19th century before Christ, the relationship with God was seen in a very direct way. Spirituality was deeply linked to national identity and everyday life. For the people of Israel, the presence of God was not something abstract or distant, but an active and real force that guided the destinies of the people. When David feels helpless, this feeling is not just personal, but a spiritual crisis that questions God's presence in his life and in the life of Israel. In this context, David's suffering is not only physical or emotional, but also spiritual. He was not just dealing with human betrayal and persecution, but with a deeper dilemma: God's apparent silence in the face of his pain. This makes Psalm 22 even more impactful, as he presents us with a David who, even in the midst of pain, ardently seeks a divine answer. His prayer is not a simple rant, but a sincere appeal to the presence of a God he knows to be faithful, even when everything around him seems to suggest otherwise. Israelite society at the time, like many ancient societies, believed deeply in the presence of God in everyday matters. Illness, victory in battle, and prosperity were seen as reflections of divine blessing or curse. Thus, when someone like David, a man after God's own heart, faced such deep afflictions, it generated a collective questioning about the state of the nation and the apparent distance from God. David was not only speaking from his personal experience, but also positioning himself as a representative of the people of Israel, whose faith was being tested. Furthermore, it is important to understand David's role as king. As the leader of a nation, he not only faced his own challenges, but also carried the weight of the people's expectations. His suffering was not just an individual thing, it reflected a national crisis. When he calls for help, he is representing an entire people who, like him, also felt the absence of God in times of distress. David's prayer, therefore, is both personal and collective, and his cry of anguish is a reflection of the cry of an entire nation that, in moments of crisis, sought a divine answer. The Bible tells us that David was a man after God's own heart, but that doesn't mean he didn't have his moments of doubt and suffering. On the contrary, the psalm he wrote is clear evidence of his inner struggle and his humanity. David does not present himself as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who is seeking the truth in the midst of pain. This honesty, this vulnerability, is what makes Psalm 22 so powerful and relevant to this day. Another important aspect to consider is the way David uses poetry to express his pain. In the Israelite tradition, poetry was not only an art form, but also a way of communicating spiritual and emotional experience. The Psalm's use of vivid metaphors and imagery creates a unique emotional environment where the words come to life and transport us into David's anguish. Images of dogs, lions, and pierced hands and feet are not just literary metaphors, but expressions of deep physical and spiritual suffering. These images continue to resonate, not just for the beauty of the poetry, but for the depth of the pain they represent. This cultural and historical context helps us better understand the weight of David's words. He is not just expressing a personal lament, but he is positioning himself as the representative of Israel, calling for a restoration of the relationship between God and his people. David's suffering, in his search for answers, is not an isolated event, but a reflection of the experiences of many who, throughout history, have found themselves in similar situations, questioning God, seeking his presence, and waiting for his intervention. David, when writing the Psalm 22, you're not just communicating your own pain. He is sharing a universal experience, the human experience of suffering and the search for meaning, especially when God seems distant. This is a powerful message for today, when so many face their own crises and wonder if God is truly present in their lives. David's cry is therefore timeless and resonates with us as an invitation to express our pain and, at the same time, trust in God's restorative presence. Psalm 22 begins with one of the most anguished cries we can hear, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These words, spoken by David in a moment of extreme pain, are not just an expression of suffering, but a visceral cry of abandonment. The feeling of being completely alone, without any sign of help or relief, is something that deeply touches the human soul. David, the man after God's own heart, finds himself faced with an immense void, and his words echo like a desperate plea for an answer that doesn't seem to come. This feeling of abandonment by God is not uncommon. At different times in our lives, many of us have been in situations where we felt as if we were completely alone, without comfort, without answers. Maybe it was in the midst of an illness that seemed to have no end, or in moments of loneliness where God's presence seemed distant. David's experience is therefore universal, as all of us, at some point, experience this feeling of disconnection with the divine. But what makes this lament even more intense is the fact that David was a man deeply faithful to God. He was not a stranger to the presence of God. On the contrary, he had experienced profound moments of intimacy with the Creator. David is not a stranger seeking God for the first time. He is someone who, in his journey of faith, had already felt the hand of God guiding and protecting him in many battles. He was the chosen one, the anointed one, the king that God had placed over the people of Israel. And yet now he feels completely abandoned. This is the pain of abandonment. It is not just the feeling of being lost in an impersonal world. but the feeling that even the one we love most and trust most seems to have walked away. David wasn't just asking where his enemies were. He was questioning where God was in the midst of his pain. He knew that the presence of God was the only thing that could give meaning to his life and his struggle. And in that moment, he didn't feel her. Abandonment from God, although harrowing, reveals something profound about the human experience of suffering. When we feel abandoned, we are not only suffering physically, but also spiritually. The absence of God at the time of suffering is an experience that many can relate to. It is as if the soul itself is torn apart, not only by what is happening on the physical plane, but by the feeling of being disconnected from the source of life, the source of all comfort and peace. The pain becomes more intense because the soul cries out for something that seems impossible to achieve: divine closeness. It is important to remember that David does not limit himself to questioning God in his pain. He expresses his emotions in a raw, open, and vulnerable way. There is no attempt to hide their fragility or to convey an image of someone who is well. David does not try to be strong on his own. He casts his complaints before God, and in doing so, allows himself to be human. This is fundamental to understanding the power of Psalm 22. He teaches us that in our darkest moments, we can be honest with God. We can cry out, we can ask, and we can express our pain without fear of being rejected. This outburst is an invitation to all of us. In our journey of faith, many of us have experienced moments of questioning and despair. It's easy to feel that when things don't go well, God abandons us. But David, by expressing his pain in such a profound way, shows us that God does not move away from us even when we do not feel his presence. He is there, even in the shadows of our anguish. David himself, when writing these words, teaches us that pain does not need to be silenced or ignored. Pain is a legitimate part of our spiritual experience. The Psalm 22. It also reveals how overwhelming pain can become when we are unable to see a way out. David not only feels helpless, but he also finds himself surrounded by enemies and false accusers. He is attacked by those who once perhaps respected and worshipped him as God's chosen king. He describes his situation so vividly that we feel like we are inside his experience. Dogs surrounded me. A pack of evildoers surrounded me, he says, bringing an image of absolute vulnerability, like an animal surrounded by hunters. David has nowhere to run. He is at the center of a circle of distress, where attacks come not just from without, but also from within his own nation, from people he probably once considered his allies. This image of being surrounded by enemies can resonate deeply with those who have ever felt in a situation where there was no one to turn to. Whether through betrayal, rejection, or abandonment, the feeling of being isolated in a time of crisis is a pain that few can ignore. David, however, does not give in to despair. He expresses his suffering but also his confidence that God at some point will respond. Psalm 22, then, is not just an outburst about abandonment and suffering, but also a reflection of the internal struggle that occurs when pain envelops us. David questions, but he also remembers who God is, and this is essential to understanding his cry. Although he does not feel God's presence at that moment, he still knows that God is faithful. He remembers the promises made to his ancestors and the power of God to free the oppressed. And so, the psalm ends not with an expression of defeat, but with a glimmer of confidence that begins to seep through, even in the shadows of his anguish. Therefore, Psalm 22 becomes a portrait of human suffering, but also an invitation to find trust in God, even when everything seems lost. David not only questions, but also subtly states that, although he does not understand the reason for the pain, he still believes in a God who is faithful. This is the heart of the psalm, an experience of pain, but also a search for answers and eventually renewed confidence. Throughout Psalm 22, David's pain unfolds into poignant images of despair. He begins with a cry of abandonment, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and describes with vivid intensity his suffering, surrounded by enemies and tormented by the feeling that God had left him. But as the psalm progresses, something begins to change, not abruptly, but through a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. David's desperate cry turns into a point of renewed hope. What seemed like a cry of despair becomes a song of confidence. This turn in the psalm is crucial because it does not happen through logical explanation or immediate divine intervention. The transformation we see in David is a choice, a decision to believe again, despite everything that is happening around him. David's suffering does not suddenly disappear, nor do his enemies cease to exist, but he begins to remember something even deeper: God's faithfulness. He begins to look beyond his pain and recognize the story of divine kindness that over the years has been with the people of Israel. The movement of his soul goes from lament to trust, and this is something that resonates not only in David's life, but in the lives of all those who in the midst of pain are challenged to maintain faith. The psalm continues with David stating, "You are holy, you who dwell among the praises of Israel." These words mark a significant transition. David's cry, although still filled with pain, begins to transform into a reminder of the nature of God. He recognizes the holiness of God and the divine presence in the midst of suffering. David, who began the psalm feeling completely abandoned, now begins to affirm the truth that God is worthy of praise, regardless of circumstances. He remembers how faithful God had been throughout Israel's history and how, even in their most difficult times, God's people always had a reason to trust in His presence. This change in perspective is fundamental to understanding Psalm 22. It is not a change that comes from a logical explanation, as if God had explained the reason for his pain to David. Change happens when David, in his anguish, chooses to remember who God is. He chooses in the midst of chaos to look at divine faithfulness in the past and realize that God never abandoned his people. It is as if, in doing so, he finds the strength he needs to continue, not because things have improved, but because he reaffirms his trust in a God who, despite everything, is worthy of praise. The trust that arises in David's heart is not a superficial trust that ignores pain or the reality of suffering. Rather, it is deeply rooted in the experience of someone who knows anguish well. David knows what it's like to be on the edge of the abyss. He knows what it's like to feel forgotten and rejected. But he also knows that even in darkness, God remains faithful. This is the power of trust that David expresses, a trust that is stronger than circumstances, deeper than pain. He holds on to the truth that God is worthy of worship, even when everything around him is falling apart. This is where Psalm 22 becomes a powerful metaphor for us all. When we face difficulties, our first reaction may be to question the presence of God. Like David, we may feel helpless, as if God has abandoned us. But the psalm teaches us that even at this point of darkness, we can choose to look to God's faithfulness in the past and trust that He will not leave us. David's trust is not a denial of pain, but a recognition that, despite everything, God is constant. He has never failed and will never fail. David also makes an important reflection on how suffering is not an isolated phenomenon. He's not just talking about his own pain, he is also speaking for the people of Israel. The psalm is a lament that expands, reaching the entire nation. When David cries out for help, he is representing the collective pain of his people. He is God's chosen king, but he is also fighting along with the nation. His renewed confidence, then, is not just a personal confidence, but a confidence that encompasses all those who find themselves in pain. And this is something that speaks directly to us. When we face difficulties, we are not alone. Suffering can be lonely, but faith in God connects us to one another, as we are all in some way seeking His restoration. This is the power of David's prayer. It begins with a cry of pain, but turns into a song of hope because David remembers who God is and what he has already done for Israel. No matter how deep the suffering, the memory of God's faithfulness is a constant reminder that, in the end, victory will be his. And by declaring his trust in God, David not only restores his own faith, but is also an example to all of us of how, even in the midst of suffering, we can choose to trust God and worship him. As the psalm unfolds, David begins to declare with more conviction that his confidence is not in his own strength or his circumstances, but in the certainty that God is faithful. He remembers that in times past, God had delivered his people from slavery, and he would do so again. This recognition that suffering is part of the journey of faith, but does not define history, is one of the most powerful teachings that Psalm 22 offers us. The Psalm 22. It is above all a testimony of faith in the midst of suffering. Throughout his journey, David teaches us something fundamental about human suffering. It is not something we can avoid or control, but it is an inevitable part of the human experience. However, the psalm also shows us that suffering, no matter how intense, is not the end of the story. It is just the beginning of a journey that takes us to a place of spiritual renewal and renewed trust in God. In our days, when we face difficulties, it is natural to question why we are going through such trials. Grief and loss challenge us to question God's presence in our lives. But Psalm 22 reminds us that suffering is not a sign of abandonment, but rather an opportunity to re-evaluate our faith and trust in God. Suffering presents us with a choice. We can succumb to hopelessness, or we can choose to trust that God, even when we don't feel his presence, is with us and will guide us toward healing and restoration. This choice, as we saw in David's trajectory, is not an easy decision. It is not a choice made superficially, as if we could simply ignore the pain. The confidence that David expresses in the midst of suffering is a confidence that comes from remembering God's faithfulness throughout history. David is not claiming that everything will improve instantly, nor that his pain will disappear without leaving a mark. He is stating that regardless of the circumstances, God remains faithful and worthy of our trust. This is a vital lesson for all of us. Even when things don't make sense, even when we don't see a solution in sight, we can still trust that God is in control. Psalm 22 also teaches us about the importance of honesty with God in our prayers. When David cries out to God, he doesn't try to hide his pain or pretend that everything is okay. He presents himself before God exactly as he is, vulnerable, distressed, and without answers. And it is this honesty that paves the way to restoration. Many times in everyday life we feel like we can't express our true pain or doubt, either because we are afraid of being judged or because we believe we must have faith at all times. However, David teaches us that true faith is not a faith that ignores pain, but a faith that stands before God with sincerity, even in the midst of despair. This does not mean that we should use our pain as an excuse to turn away from God, but rather that we should recognize that in times of suffering, it is more important than ever to turn to Him. Suffering does not take us away from God, but if we allow it, it can bring us closer to His presence. The Psalm 22. It teaches us that even in our darkest moments, God is not far away. He hears us, He sees us, and He is ready to restore and heal. Another crucial point that David teaches us is that suffering is not something we must face alone. The psalm, despite being a personal prayer, has a collective character. David, in his suffering, also represents the suffering of the people of Israel. He is not just talking about his own pain, but the pain of an entire nation. And in doing so, he reminds us that we are not alone in our struggles. Suffering is something that connects us to each other. In times of pain, we can support each other, knowing that we are part of a community that shares the human experience of struggle and hope. Faith, however personal it may be, is also something we must live in community. Psalm 22 teaches us the importance of not isolating ourselves in our moments of suffering, but of seeking the company of others who can walk with us, offer support, and above all, remind us of God's faithfulness, even when the pain seems unbearable. The confidence that David expresses throughout the psalm is a confidence that does not depend on understanding all the answers to suffering. Often in our own lives, we seek explanations for everything that happens. We want to understand why something is happening to us or to someone we love. But Psalm 22 challenges us to trust, even when we don't understand. True trust in God does not require that we understand every detail, but that we trust His nature and His promise that He is faithful. David's trust is not a trust based on a logical explanation, but on a relationship with God that transcends human understanding. He knows that regardless of the circumstances, God is trustworthy. This is the kind of faith that Psalm 22 invites us to cultivate, a faith that does not waver in the face of pain, a faith that is sustained by the certainty that God is faithful and has always been present, even when we do not feel His presence. The confidence David expresses is a confidence that grows as we remember all that God has done in the past and trust that He will do the same for us in the future. The psalm, therefore, is an invitation to remember and revive our faith in difficult times and to learn to trust God in a deeper and more real way. On a more practical level, we can apply Psalm 22 in our daily lives when we face moments of distress. Instead of looking for immediate answers or quick solutions, we can learn to open up to God in a vulnerable way, expressing our pain and doubts. We can remember the times God has helped us in the past and hold on to the knowledge that He is with us, even when we can't see the solution. We can also learn to seek the company of others, recognizing that suffering is not something we must bear alone, but something that can be shared in community, where we find strength and comfort. Psalm 22 does not offer an immediate explanation for human suffering, but it offers us something much more powerful, a way to deal with pain, a path to restoring trust in God, and finally, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God is with us, ready to restore us and lead us to healing. The trust that David expresses is not an easy or superficial trust, but a trust that is refined in the fires of pain, and that reminds us that although suffering is real, God's faithfulness is even more real. When David in Psalm 22 cries out to God, his words are a reflection of deep and devastating suffering. It begins with the cry of abandonment, a feeling of despair that touches the hearts of everyone who has ever felt lost, as if God were distant and indifferent. But what David teaches us with this psalm is that suffering is not the end, but the beginning of a journey that leads us to something greater, the renewal of our trust in God. The psalm, with all its vivid images of pain, also offers us a message of restoration, a profound lesson in faith that challenges us to look beyond our pain and trust in a God who never abandons us. As David moves from desperate cry to confident praise, he shows us that faith is not a pain-free path. On the contrary, true faith is forged in the fire of anguish and struggle. Trust in God, as David teaches us, is not based on an absence of suffering, but on an unshakable certainty that, even in the most difficult circumstances, God remains faithful. And it is precisely this fidelity that must be the basis of our faith. When we face our own difficulties, rather than giving in to despair, we can follow David's example, remembering God's faithfulness in our lives and in past generations. The Psalm 22, it does not offer us easy answers to suffering, nor does it promise us that the pain will disappear instantly. What he offers us, however, is something much more powerful, the assurance that even when we don't understand, God is there. David begins with a painful question, but throughout the psalm, he remembers God's presence and His faithfulness. He is able to move from anguish to confidence, from doubt to certainty. And that is what makes this psalm so powerful. It is not just a lament, but a testimony that even in the darkest moments, the light of hope never completely goes out. What Psalm 22 teaches us is that trust in God does not depend on our understanding of everything that happens in our lives. When we go through moments of pain, Sometimes we do not find immediate answers or satisfactory explanations, but faith does not require us to understand everything. It requires trust. True faith is that, even when we are in the valley of the shadow of death, we can look to God and believe that He is with us, sustaining us and guiding us. This is the fundamental lesson of Psalm 22, that even in moments of greatest suffering, we can choose to trust God. David shows us that pain does not need to be denied or ignored, but rather that, by facing it honestly before God, we find strength to continue the journey. He invites us to cry out, to be vulnerable, and to trust in a God who never fails. The pain does not disappear immediately, but trust in God strengthens us and gives us hope that He will bring restoration. Psalm 22 also teaches us that faith is not an isolated experience, but a communal one. David, although he expresses deep personal pain, is not alone in his struggle. He is the representative of the entire nation of Israel, and his words resonate not only with him, but with all those who suffer. The suffering of one can become the suffering of many, and the faith of one can become the faith of all. In times of pain, we can find comfort not only in our own trust in God, but also in the support and faith of our community. Faith, like Psalm 22 shows us, is a journey we travel together as part of a body of believers who share the same hope. This lesson of community is especially important in the world we live in today, where many feel isolated in their struggles. The temptation to withdraw from others, to suffer in silence, is great. But Psalm 22 teaches us that suffering is not something we must face alone. Just as David cried out for help, we too must seek support from our brothers and sisters in faith. Community is a place where we can be honest about our struggles and where we can remind each other of God's faithfulness. Furthermore, the psalm challenges us to apply the power of memory. When David moves from pain to confidence, he remembers God's actions in the past. He remembers how God acted on behalf of Israel throughout history. When we face our own difficulties, it is easy to forget all that God has done for us. But Psalm 22 invites us to remember the times when God was with us, sustained us, and gave us the strength to overcome previous challenges. The memory of God's faithfulness is what allows us to look to the future with confidence, knowing that He will continue to guide us. Psalm 22 is also an invitation to worship. David, when going through his pain, still manages to affirm God's holiness and faithfulness. He teaches us that worship is not just a response to moments of blessing, but a response to God who remains faithful, even when we are in the midst of the storm. When we worship, we recognize God's sovereignty over all things, including our suffering. Worship is an affirmation that, despite circumstances, God is worthy of praise. Psalm 22 also points to a deeper truth, that the healing we seek, whether emotional, spiritual, or even physical, comes from surrendering to God. The psalm begins with a cry of pain, but ends with an expression of trust and adoration. This transformation happens not because David was immediately freed from his pain, but because he chose to give his life to God, trust in His faithfulness, and worship His holiness, even in the midst of crisis. True healing begins when, despite the pain, we choose to give God our praise. Just like David, we all face moments of difficulty and suffering, but the message of Psalm 22 is clear. Pain is not the end of the story. Even when we don't see an immediate solution, we can trust in a God who never fails, who hears us, and who is with us, even in the darkest hours. Suffering is part of the human journey, but faith, hope, and trust in God take us beyond pain to restoration and renewal. The Psalm 22. It is a testimony that, in the midst of suffering, we can always find hope, because God is faithful and worthy of our trust. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.